Hi everyone, welcome back. So today we're going to be talking about differential reinforcement of low rates of responding. This is the last part of the three-part lecture on differential reinforcement schedule. So we talked about differential reinforcement of alternative behavior. Then we talked about differential reinforcement of other behavior. And today I'm going to talk about differential reinforcement of low rates of responding, or DRL. So differently from the two other schedules of differential reinforcement that we talked about, DRL is not designed to completely eliminate behavior. DRA and DRO, yes, responding is not reinforcing those conditions, at least the target behavior you're trying to decrease doesn't produce consequences, is actually placed under extinction. And of course, in the case of DRA, an alternative response produces reinforcement. In the case of DRO, the non-occurrence of the target behavior produces reinforcement. In the case of DRL, as the name says, low rates of responding are going to be reinforced. So how do we produce low rates of responding? How do we reinforce low rates of responding? And when would we want to do that? So DRL, it's used when we want to get a certain behavior to occur less often. So not necessarily eliminate. Maybe the behavior, it's okay for the behavior to occur, but maybe not as often, right? Maybe it's a little annoying. And I'm going to give you the example of someone maybe talking too much in class or raising his or her hand too often. It's okay to do that, but maybe not all the time. So in this case, reinforcement is delivered following each occurrence of the target behavior that is separated from the previous response by a minimum amount of time or contingent on a number of responses within a period, not exceeding a certain criteria. So, as the example that I gave you, a student raising his or her hand too often. So, it can be separated from a previous response by a minimum amount of time. So, you can say, you can only raise your hand after 2 minutes since you've raised your hand previously. So, that's an option, right? So, you can only raise your hand every 2 minutes. Or maybe there's a certain number of responses within a period of time. So, you know what? During class time, you can only raise your hand 3 times. And if you do that, then you can contact the reinforcer. So notice the two different ways of doing it. If instructions can be given, of course, in this case, if a student can just be told, hey, you can only raise your hand 3 times in class or twice, and that's sufficient, then you might not need to use a direct contingency such as DRL. But we are assuming here that if instruction is not really producing the behavior change that you expect to produce, then a DRL schedule may be your best bet, your best choice. Now, there's 2 types of DRA that the book talks about, and I'm going to talk about 3 kinds. So the book talks about full session DRA and space responding, DRL, full session DRL and space responding DRL. I'm also going to talk to you about interval DRL, which is just breaking the full session DRL into smaller intervals. So it's kind of in a way, you could see it as a type of full session DRL. But I'm going to talk to you about the 3 different kinds. So my PowerPoint says 2 types of DRL because that's what you have in the book, but I'm going to talk to you about 3 different kinds of DRL procedures. So someone who's just seeing the PowerPoint without the sound is going to wonder whether or not Dr. Miguel knows how to count, but I do. So let's talk about full session DRL. So with full session DRL, the reinforcer is delivered when fewer than a specified number of responses occurs per time period. So the time period can be an instructional time period, for example, a class period, if you're doing this in the context of a classroom or school. A lot of the examples in this unit had to do with either typically developing kids or kids with disabilities engaging problem behavior. And partially because that's sort of my bias. I've done a lot of work with children, so a lot of my examples are related to children. I think a lot of the examples in the book as well. So here, the instructional period, like I said, could be a classroom, or if you're dealing with a child in your clinic, or we could refer to that as a treatment session. So again, the reinforcer in this case is delivered at the end of the session. So the timing of the response is not important, because it doesn't matter when the response is, when the target behavior occurs, as long as there's less than a certain number of target behaviors, then reinforcement will follow, right? So for example, you can have 4 disruptions per class period. Only 4. If you have any more than 4, there'll be no reinforcement. But if you have 4 or less disruptions, then reinforcement will be provided. So notice that the timing when those responses occur doesn't matter. So if it's a 15-minute class period, then if you have 4 disruptions in the beginning of the class, that's fine as long as you don't engage in any more disruptions. If you only engage in those 4 disruptions, then you contact reinforcement at the end of class. Same, you could engage in the 4 disruptions at the end, or maybe a couple in the beginning. It doesn't matter when the disruptions occur, as long as you don't surpass that number. So if you respond more than 4 times, then you're not going to get the reinforcer. Does that make sense? So that's essentially the full session. So you have to respond with a certain number of responses. You have to engage in a certain number of responses, less than a certain number of responses per full session, per session, or instructional or treatment session. How about the interval DRL? Well, the interval DRL would be if you now get that full session, and instead of looking at the behavior during the full session, you divide the session into intervals, right? So imagine here we're talking about my class, 50 minutes. We're going to break down into 5 10-minute intervals. And you do that for observational purposes, to make your observation easier. So now we're going to talk about fewer than a specified number of responses must occur per interval for reinforcement to be delivered. So now I want only 1 response per interval. In this case, it will be, there's 5 intervals, so they can be only 1 response per interval, right? If you exceed more than 1 response per interval, then the opportunity for reinforcement is lost. So here's the example that I have in the PowerPoint. Imagine a star is given to a student every 10 minutes with 1 or less distracting behaviors. So maybe here I'm trying to teach this kid to concentrate, and we're defining distractive behaviors that may be looking away, maybe looking at someone else or something else, moving your eyes away from whatever it is that you're reading, maybe looking at your phone. So essentially everything other than looking at the material, we would consider as looking away. Now, looking away is okay. Like, no one is going to sit down and read something and not look anywhere else, not get distracted for a full solid 50 minutes. But maybe, like I said, maybe it's okay for you to look away once in a while, but not all the time. So here we're going to say, well, we want the looking away behavior to decrease. Doesn't have to be eliminated, because sometimes it's okay to just look away, but when can the child look away in this case? So the student can look away at least only once during each interval, right? If the student looks away more than once, he loses the reinforcer. So here, a star, which is the reinforcer in this case, and then later it can be exchanged by something, a star is given to the student every 10 minutes. So by the end of the interval, a star is given as long as the participant engaged in only 1 or less, which will be 0, looking away. So if the child didn't look away at all, gets a star. The child looked away once, the child still gets the star. But if the child looked away twice during that 10-minute interval, the child doesn't get the star, and then a new interval starts, right? So yeah, you can be distracted, but you can only be distracted once per 10-minute interval, right? So differently than DRO, remember DRO, the reinforcer is delivered in the absence of the problem behavior, which means you wouldn't be able to look away at all if this was a DRO procedure. But a DRL procedure, we are saying you can look away only once, right? Because maybe the kid is looking away 10 times per 10 minutes, right? I mean, it's just like insane. I'm like, okay, you can only look away once per 10 minutes. If you do it, fine, we tolerate one distraction per 10 minutes, but any more than 2 distractions per 10 minutes, reinforcement is lost and a new interval starts. How about space responding DRL? Now, with space responding DRL, the reinforcer is delivered for a response when that response is separated from the previous response by a specified amount of time. So it's essentially like you can only respond if a certain amount of time has passed since the last time that you responded. And the time between behaviors, or the time between responses, is referred in the literature as inter-response time. So the time between responses, inter-response time. Now, if a response occurs before the end of that interval, the interval is reset. So if the response occurs prior, right, to that interval between responses, then reinforcement is not delivered and you start again, right? So you need to have a time between. So the individual responses are reinforced when the inter-response time is greater than X, right? So you can only have responses occurring at 2 or more minutes in between responses. So if you engage in one response, you have to wait 2 minutes until you can engage in the next response. If you engage in the next response in less than 2 minutes, then reinforcement wouldn't be delivered and a new interval would start, right? The timer would start again. So in this case, the timing of the response is important, right? Because again, it's not like, well, you can engage in four disruptions either in the beginning or the end of the class. Here, you can only engage in a disruption, let's say, every 5 minutes. So if you engage in one disruption and another disruption, there's no reinforcement, right? But when would you use that? Here's an example of an article in which they did use a space responding DRL. This is an old article from 1980, but for rapid eating. Now notice that's a perfect example of a DRL. You want to differentially reinforce low rates of behavior, right? I mean, eating very rapidly might not be very good for you. So you still need to eat. You don't want to eliminate this behavior, but you want this behavior to occur at a lower rate, right? So this is a study conducted in 1980. So let's look and see what they've done. Participants here were individuals with intellectual disabilities, right? That ate very fast. And we're going to look at their data, the baseline data, to see how fast they actually ate. So again, like I've done in previous PowerPoints, I just took an excerpt from the paper, cut, copy and paste, as you can see. So I'm going to read it to you. So each time, remember, this is 1980. They're calling participants subjects. So each time the participant paused independently for at least 1 or 2 seconds. So they started by, so that tells you that they were probably eating very rapidly, because here they had to pause for at least 1 or 2 seconds. All they need to do is pause for 1 to 2 seconds initially, following a bite. And if they ate and paused for 1 to 2 seconds, the trainer would praise the participant for pausing, like, nice job taking a break, and then gave him or her a bite of a favorite food, right? So there was like the praise and the favorite food as the reinforcer, which I'm assuming was something different from what the participant was eating. Makes sense, because they would get a bite of dessert or an extra portion of whatever meal was known to be preferred. So there was, I guess, a lot of eating in this study, right? Because they were taking bites of whatever it is that they were eating. So maybe they're taking bites of, like, I don't know, a meatloaf. So they're taking bites of meatloaf, and then if they pause for 1 to 2 seconds, I guess they'll have access to a piece of pie, which will be weird. You're eating meatloaf or pie, but who knows? I mean, some people are doing that now. Anyway, or they will get an extra portion of something that they liked. But so initially, very few independent pauses occurred. So the participants were not pausing. So the experimenters had to prompt them to pause, like take a break, or they may have done some, physical prompting, like holding participants from taking the bite. Now, if the participant began to take a bite without pausing, the trainer would say, wait. So that's essentially what I was telling you. Place his spoon on the table and the hand on the table, so there's some physical prompting, and then reinforce the participant with praise and then with a bite of a preferred food. Now, the participants were then allowed to take another bite, and was again, they were either reinforced or pausing or prompted. So the prompting or correction procedure was essentially saying wait and then putting their hands and spoon down on the table. So they had to wait that 1 to 2 seconds before taking a bite again. And of course, they planned to fade the prompt, right? So then the participants would pause independently. So, you guys already learned about different kinds of prompting. So that was a prompting procedure here. Now, lots of text. So let me read it to you. So when a participant paused independently between approximately 75% of the bites, right? So they were pausing, those 1 to 2 second pauses, then prompted pauses were no longer reinforced. So again, if they're doing it independently for about 75%, they stop reinforcing the prompted pauses and we're only reinforcing independent pauses, right? And here, notice they were reinforcing independent pauses of 5 seconds. Now they change to 5 seconds. If they stop after they take a bite, 5 seconds until they take the next bite. So look at your inter-response time. The inter-response time is 5 seconds. So from the time they take a bite to the time they have to take the next bite, they have to wait 5 seconds in order for reinforcement to be delivered, right? If they don't wait 5 seconds, then there is no reinforcement. So again, subjects or participants were reinforced only for independent pauses of 5 seconds and reminded to wait when they attempted to take another bite before the 5 seconds elapsed. 3 participants reached this phase within 2 meals. Participant 3 required 10 meals to reach this criterion. After 2 meals under this procedure, then reinforcement was thinned. So what does that mean? It means that they started delivering less reinforcement to sort of promote this generalization and not over reliance on external types of reinforcers. Because, theoretically, the food should be reinforcing. So they did that, and then noticed that in order to promote generalization of the skills, over the next 2 to 3 meals, the trainer gradually began to move away from the participant, sitting and standing further and further, moving around the perimeter. And if I'm not mistaken, if you keep reading the article, it tells you how other staff members did it. And, and then essentially they tried to make sure that this was happening in the absence of, folks around and so forth. So the participants could do that on their own. They could just, eat slowly without having to have someone there prompting and reinforcing all the time, which is, the ideal outcome. You have generalization across settings and individuals, and you have maintenance of the behavior over time. Now let's look at the results. Here we have the average of 2 daily meals appearing on your x-axis, and then you have bites per 30 seconds on your y-axis. We have 2 participants here. I don't have the graph for the third one, just a sample of the 2 participants. Now check this out. There are 10 bites per 30 seconds. That's very fast, right? And then same here, about 12 bites per 30 seconds, an average of 10 bites per 30 seconds. That's a lot of eating. That's eating very fast. Now, notice that once they started the treatment, it went down significantly. Now they're, at about 30 seconds. So in a minute, they're taking 4 bites per minute, right? Here they're taking during baseline, about 20 bites per minute. That's fast. So it goes down. The same thing with treatment for participant 2 in a multiple baseline. So they implement treatment with participant 1. It doesn't change the behavior of participant 2, then suggesting that it wasn't something else that happened in the environment. Otherwise, both participants' behavior would have decreased. So only the participant who received the intervention, we saw a decrease in behavior. And then, of course, later on, the effects are replicated for the second participant. So implemented later at a period of time, and then that decreases. Remember the logic of the multiple baseline, right? So the baseline itself tells you, or is a prediction that will tell you if no intervention took place, behavior would continue on this pattern, right? And that is actually the case here. You verify it here, like behavior continues on this pattern. Then you implement the procedure at different points in time. You implement the procedure here, behavior decreases, and then you replicate it at a different point in time. So you see a replication of the procedure. And of course, it was at a different point in time. So you could not say that it was something that happened at this point, because otherwise this behavior would have decreased as well. And here's the fun fact. So what they did is they also did a reversal design within the multiple baseline. So they had a multiple baseline design and a reversal design, because for participant 1, they went ahead, removed the treatment, behavior went up, and then they implemented the treatment again. So they have another replication. So they have a replication within participant and a replication across participants, leading you to conclude that behavior decreased due to the intervention and nothing else. So pretty solid experimental control here in a study that only employed 3 participants. I'm only showing you 2, but there was a graph for another participant. Now, hopefully the description of those 3 types of DRL made sense. Now, can I give you a couple more examples of DRL? Sure. So imagine a full session DRL. Dessert here is given if the child gets up from the table fewer than 3 times during supper. So again, it's a full session. Supper, lasts, I don't know, an hour, 40 minutes. So it doesn't matter the timing of the response. As long as you don't get out of the table more than 3 times, everything will be fine. You get your dessert. But if you get out of the table more than 3 times, that's a problem. So you're trying to get low rates of behavior, right? So you want to get the behavior that maybe was occurring 5, maybe the kid is getting out of the table 5, 6 times. Now you're saying it's okay for you to get out of the table, but it has to be 3 or less times that you do that. Otherwise, you won't get dessert. With space responding DRL, and remember, I'm giving you those 2 examples because I'm only going to be asking you questions about full session and space responding, not interval. Interval is sort of a variation of the full session, but just learn about full session and space responding for the exam. Now, with space responding, remember, we're looking into response time. We really care about the timing of the response. So here, the child called on to answer in class only if it has been 10 minutes since the last time he raised his hand, right? So you have to wait 10 minutes. So the timing is important. The inter-response time must be 10 minutes or more. If you respond in less than 10 minutes from your last response, then no reinforcement will be provided, and then we'll have to wait another 10 minutes for you to be able to respond. Otherwise, no reinforcement is delivered. So again, both procedures, not to eliminate behavior, just to reduce behavior to a manageable level. Now, you can think about behaviors that you engage in that maybe you're doing it too often and you want to do it less time. Maybe you're complaining too much. Maybe it's okay to complain at home to your significant other, but maybe you shouldn't be complaining every minute, or you shouldn't be complaining every hour. Maybe you can have some sort of full session DRL where you can only complain about stuff twice or once a day. So if you complain in the morning, then you're done, right? If it's twice a day, then if it's full session DRL, you're only allowed to complain twice. I mean, if you complain in the morning twice, then you're done complaining for that day, right? The space responding DRL would be like, hey, you can complain, but you can only complain every 10 hours. So if you made a complaint, you have to wait another 10 hours to complain about something again. Otherwise, there might be no reinforcement there, right? So that will be a space responding DRL. Space responding DRL sometimes is used for people that want to, maybe they want to smoke less. I mean, usually you probably want to eliminate smoking completely, but maybe people want to just smoke less. So instead of saying, I want to just smoke 2 cigarettes a day, I want to start by, smoking 1 cigarette every hour, and then 1 cigarette every 2 hours, and then 3 hours and 5 hours and so forth, right? So now I'm only smoking like 3 cigarettes a day or something. Same with drinking. Maybe you can only have a couple of beers a day, or will be in the full session DRL, or maybe I can only have a beer if I have if I had a beer 5 hours earlier or something. There will be space responding DRL. So you can see that those procedures can be used and will be you'll be fit different kinds of issues. How do you implement DRL? First, you have to ask yourself if DRL is the appropriate procedure to be used here. Do you want to decrease but not necessarily eliminate the behavior? Then DRL might be your option as a procedure. Now, if you want to eliminate the behavior completely, maybe the smoking and the drinking are things that you should be completely eliminating. And if that's the case, then maybe DRA or DRO are your best options there. Then you have to determine if it's okay for the behavior to occur, what are the acceptable levels of the behavior? So how do you figure that out? I mean, you may look at what other individuals do, right? So if I'm thinking about concentrating, like remember the example of like, not looking away for a specific amount of time. How often do people look away, and what is considered to be, typical, and what's considered to be okay when someone is studying and concentrating? How often can you look away? Because I can't just say, oh, you can only look away once every 5 hours. Like no one is just going to stare at a computer or at a piece of paper for 4 or 5 hours straight, right? So you might have to determine, it's like it's okay to look away and be distracted every 10 minutes. So maybe your DRL is a space responding DRL of 10 minutes. So you have to determine the acceptable level of the behavior by probably looking at other individuals in the natural environment, maybe asking experts and so forth. Decide again if you want to do full session DRL or space responding DRL. Of course, inform the client of the criterion of reinforcement. If you can just get the responding by instructing the client, that is always great. The procedure would still work if the client doesn't understand the procedure, because reinforcement, it has this automaticity to it, right? Whatever behavior a reinforcement is contingent upon, that behavior increases. And so if you start reinforcing a certain dimension of behavior, if you start reinforcing behavior occurring at a certain amount of time in between behaviors, so if you start reinforcing certain inter-response time, you see the behavior occurring within that interval. So you get what you reinforce essentially. You can use a procedure to give the client feedback on the number of responses or timing of responses. Again, if your client is verbal, you can explain it. You can say, nice job just responding 3 times in class, or nice job just raising your hand 3 times in class, or something like that. You may have to use intermediate goals. They did it in the rapid eating study, right? So initially, you just need to pause for a second or two. And once you meet that criterion, then we're going to increase to a higher goal here. Now we're going to have to wait 3 or 4 minutes or 5 minutes or 5 seconds, sorry, between bites, right? 5 minutes would be too long. You take a bite, you wait 5 minutes, take another bite, your food's already cold. So 5 seconds. That's it, guys. Look, it got dark. This is a short lecture. I just wanted to introduce the notion of DRL. Again, make sure that if you have any questions, you post them in the discussion board. And I'll be posting this PowerPoint now that I finished. There's an exam this Friday. Let me know if you have any questions. Some of you emailed me for office hours. That's great. Yeah, hopefully you guys are all safe, and I'll see you soon. Remember, the exam will be on Canvas, posted on Friday, and you have 50 minutes to answer. If you have any questions about the exam, let me know, but it'll be the same as last time. Bye, everyone.